Right, so at the end of the previous video we stopped at a question about where on this picture you would have high levels of oxygen and where you would have low levels of oxygen, and the same for carbon dioxide. And then the next question was why is this the case? So if you guys in the room to help me to kind of summarize what we discussed at the end of last lesson, and summarize it for the people who are watching the videos. So Terry, when it comes to oxygen, so what am I putting here inside alveolus? Is that going to be high level or low level of oxygen?
High.
So that's going to be high. And then, Kira, compared to that amount of oxygen, what have I got inside my
Got a low
alveolus? So that's going to be low concentration, low amount of oxygen. Okay, and Abby, when it comes to carbon dioxide, how much carbon dioxide, relatively speaking, do I have inside the alveolus? That's going to be low amount, so low CO2. And finally, Laura, high. That is going to be high amount of carbon dioxide inside the capillary. Okay, so that's the picture we're dealing with. So on either side, inside your alveolus and inside your capillary, you've got to have difference in amounts of carbon dioxide or difference in the amount of oxygen in order for these gases to be able to move from one area to the other. If the amounts were exactly the same, or we call it concentration, if the concentrations were exactly the same, no movement of gases would have taken place at all. Okay? So the next question we discussed was, why is this the case? Why do I have a low amount of oxygen in the capillary, in the blood, which which is being brought by the capillary to the lungs, and why do I have high amount of carbon dioxide in the blood, which is arriving into the lungs? And Kira, I think you had a really good answer too, so do you mind repeating the same answer you gave me earlier?
Well, it will be a low concentration of oxygen because the organs of the body have already taken, and the muscles of the body have already taken the oxygen it needs.
Okay.
So the blood coming back past that will be of a lower concentration.
Yeah. And what about carbon dioxide?
Carbon dioxide will be of a higher concentration because in the capillary.
Yeah.
It will be of a higher concentration because as a result of absorbing the oxygen, you release carbon dioxide.
Yeah. So what do we call the process which is happening in, say, muscle cells, which consumes oxygen and produces carbon dioxide? Respiration, absolutely, aerobic respiration. So we then need to have a look back at the equation for aerobic respiration to be able to make sense of it. So remember that equation, we had oxygen being consumed and carbon dioxide being produced in your body by all the cells in your body in order for them to be able to produce energy and live, essentially. So by the time that blood arrives back to your lungs, it dropped all the goodies, all the oxygen's been dropped off and delivered to those cells, and all the rubbish stuff, including carbon dioxide, got picked up. So that blood, when it arrives to the depot, to the lungs, it's got very low levels of oxygen and very high levels of carbon dioxide. I usually give people this kind of little analogy of a Tesco delivery van, right? So all the cells said, we want oxygen, right? That's our order. Can you bring it to us, right? So your imaginary Tesco van, which is the bloodstream, right? It went to the lungs, picked up oxygen, and now it's delivering everything throughout your body. And if you imagine that your shopping van not just delivered the stuff to you, all the food, but also picked up your rubbish on the way, how wonderful would that be? So that's what your blood is doing, delivering all the nutrients and oxygen it needs for the cells, but also picking up all the rubbish. So that's why by the end, that delivery system arrived back to the depot, to the lungs, then it's got very low amount of shopping, if you like, of oxygen, and very high amount of rubbish, of carbon dioxide. So that's what those pictures are showing. So we've got this relatively high concentration of oxygen in the alveolus, and relatively low level of oxygen in the capillary. And so therefore, Terry, you will have to help me with that one. In what direction is oxygen wanting to move? From high to low concentration or from low to high?
High
high to low. So I've got to draw my arrow showing the direction of movement of oxygen from the alveolus into the capillary. And then the same is going to be true for carbon dioxide. So that's going to be moving again from area of high concentration to the area of low concentration. So that's going to be the movement of carbon dioxide in that system. So then we also discussed the name for this mechanism which moves substances from high concentration to low concentration. So Abby, what do we call that mechanism? Diffusion, exactly. So diffusion is the name, so I'm going to just do it as a little recap because normally this is done as a part of cell biology, so you would have come across it before, or if you are watching the video, it might be that you're going to come across it very, very shortly as a part of the cell biology unit, but for now I'm just going to write down definition. So diffusion is a mechanism of moving substances across cell membrane, and it's going from area of high concentration of substances to the area of low concentration. Right? So it's movement of substances from high to low. So from high concentration to low concentration. Now, can you remember from your cell biology, does that require energy? Do we need to spend energy doing diffusion, or does it happen sort of automatically without needing any extra energy? Can you remember that bit? If I'm going from high concentration to low concentration, is that something which is normally going to occur anyway? Or do I need to spend a bit of energy on it? Maybe? Just occurs. So it does not require energy from your body. So no energy. So no energy is required for that process.
Is it called like passive diffusion?
Yeah, passive. So it's a passive form of transport, right? The opposite, can you remember the opposite when I'm trying to move substances from high concentration to low? It's nothing to do with movement of gases, but just a little recap from something maybe you remember. Does anybody remember what we call that particular way of transporting substances?
Gases exchange.
No, that's going to be gases exchange, and in gases exchange you're using diffusion, right? Which is name of a mechanism.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about the name of a mechanism which is not part of this process, but it does happen in other parts of your body, where you're moving substances from low to high concentration in the opposite direction. Can anybody remember what this process is called?
Is that osmosis?
Not osmosis. One more. It was another cell biology assignment, and it was ages ago for you. No. No. So you have passive transport, and you also, Terry, have active transport, right? So the name for that particular type of movement would be active transport. It doesn't occur here, but it does occur in other parts of your body. Does that one require energy, by the way?
Yeah.
Yes, it does, right? Because you're moving in the opposite direction from low to high. The usual analogy I give people, right? You'll probably go for walks in the Peak District sometimes. Does anybody go? Occasionally? Come on, you live right next door to it. Beautiful, beautiful countryside. And if you have one field of sheep, and you have lots and lots of sheep in this field, and another field next door which has got no sheep, and you've got a gate in between, well, if you open that gate, what's going to happen to those sheep? They're going to spread about, right? So that's the analogy of your diffusion, right? From high concentration, from a big flock where everybody's squished into one field, you give them no space, they're going to naturally want to wander off and go to this next field, at least some of them, and spread out. So that's going to be an analogy of diffusion. But if you were trying to do the opposite way, now you're wanting, this flock to go back, into a smaller space, into a smaller field. Do they want to do it? So what you have to do is get a farmer, train a dog, get a little, tractor or something, or run, alongside your dog, and get the dog to run with sheep and get them to move back. So you're spending essentially energy, right, to do the opposite. So the same is true for your body, right? When you're trying to move substances from low concentration, bunch them back together closely, and you need to spend energy. Diffusion, no energy required, right? Just open the gates and off it goes, right? As long as you have this difference in concentrations, you're good. Okay. So the next thing we're going to talk about is list all the factors which make that diffusion, which make that gas exchange possible. Okay? I will have to wipe some of the information off so I have a bit of space. Is that all right? Yeah? So I'm going to get rid of this and maybe get rid of this bit here. And just rewrite it. So this is endothelial. Okay, so let's list some of the factors which are making that diffusion possible. So factors that make diffusion possible. And also kind of make it easier, make it more straightforward, easier to happen. So possible, easier to happen. Okay. So the first thing you need for diffusion to occur is the difference in concentrations. If both concentrations were exactly the same, so that oxygen and that oxygen were exactly the same amount, the diffusion would not occur. What do we call that difference in concentrations? Now, Kira, you already gave me that term earlier on, actually, probably without being...
Gaseous exchange.
Well, that's what happens. Gaseous exchange is what's happening here overall. I'm asking for the term given for the difference in concentrations. One side of a picture versus the other side. What do we call that difference in concentrations? No, you didn't use the word earlier on, promise. You can't recall now.
Concentration gradient.
Concentration gradient. Yeah, recall that?
Yes,
right.
yeah.
So let's write that down. So it's concentration gradient. So I'm not going to write a lot because I want you to use your own understanding and a little bit of extra research to expand on those terms. So I'll kind of talk about it, but I'm not going to be explicitly writing down explanation. So concentration gradient in a nutshell is the difference in concentration. As I said, there's no difference. That would mean you reached equilibrium, equal amount on both sides of your system, and then no movement is occurring at all. So you have to have concentration gradient. And the higher that concentration gradient, the easier it is for things to move, right? So gradient, you can think about it like a little hill, right? So if the hill is steep and you roll the ball, it's going to roll quicker. And if the hill is not as steep, then the ball is going to slow down. So the same kind of idea, that's where the term gradient comes from. So the bigger difference between highest and the lowest points, the quicker that process is going to occur. And if the difference is not as big, then the process is going to slow down. Okay, something else we discussed is one of the structural adaptations. Terry, you had an idea about what is making things in this system easier to occur, and your suggestion was, can you just repeat what we were discussing previously?
Like the squamous cells are quite thin, so it's a short diffusion.
Right. So the cells are flattened. You remember I specifically talk about squamous cells at length. Why they flatter? Because that makes the distance for these gases to travel much shorter, much more thin, right? And that means that the gases can get through those cells more easily. So we call it short diffusion pathway. So this short diffusion pathway is first of all created by the fact that you've got this very specially designed cells, squamous cells, very flattened cells. So the path is small by squamous cells. Right, and those are cells not just in the alveolus, you remember, but also in the capillary. And there is another thing which creates shorter diffusion pathway, which is not maybe apparent from my diagram particularly, but that distance between the alveolus and the capillary is actually relatively small. So can you see that bit here? I could have probably drawn it even closer together. So it's usually very, very, this kind of located very close to each other. So created by squamous cells and also created by short distance between the alveolus and the capillary. So that little distance here is usually very small, okay? Between alveolus. I'll put alveoli in plural because obviously we're talking about many alveoli and many capillaries and capillaries. Okay, I'm going to carry on with this list, so I'll try to squeeze on a few more and then I might have to wipe this side off so I have more space. Does anybody have any other suggestions? What else is making that process easier? Or making sure that you've got lots of oxygen coming into your bloodstream?
I've got one.
Yeah, go on.
The lungs will expand the surface area.
Right.
And in doing so, the alveoli will expand.
Yeah, exactly.
And the expansion of that, what's it called? The lining, the lining of it, or the lining of the alveoli expanding, will make it, in turn make it easier for air to pass through. Right.
So basically what you're saying is, and I think that those were the key words, is the surface area. Yeah. So essentially, in order for this process to be efficient, you need very large surface area. And that's my next point, which is excellent. So large surface area. So if I was trying to get oxygen through skin, and some organisms do that, they get sort of oxygen through skin and they get rid of carbon dioxide if they're very small. Well, the overall area of my skin might be something like 1.5, maybe 2 square meters, right? When it comes to lungs, if I take all of my alveoli out and flatten them out and put them all onto a single surface, that what I will find is that I've got around about 70 square meters of alveoli giving me that exchange area for oxygen to get into my bloodstream and for carbon dioxide to come out. So can you see the difference? So I can't afford to breathe through skin because I just would not be able to get enough oxygen into my body. That's why you have a separate structure, which is your lungs and all the alveoli. So you have roundabout, let me just look up the numbers. So I'm getting it wrong. It will depend from source to source of information. That's number from one of the sources I have. So you have round about 700 million individual alveoli. And these result, as I said, if I try to spread them all out into a single area, they would result in about 70 square meters of surface area. And in books or websites, it's usually kind of linked to an area of a tennis court. So imagine a tennis court, right? That's the area you have of your gas exchange in your lungs.
If you spread it all out.
If you spread it all out. And so how does it all fit inside you, all these 70 square meters? Well, they fit because the alveoli are this kind of bubble shape, right? And because they are microscopic, so you can fit lots and lots and lots of them in a very small amount of space. And that's why you create this enormous surface area, right? Now, here is where some people get a little bit confused. And the confusion is usually between short diffusion pathway and large surface area. And to illustrate that, let me just give a little illustration. Let me just see. Oh, does anybody have a small notepad? Now, can I borrow that one? Just for a minute, just that one.
Oh yeah, that one.
Right. So let's think about the difference, right? Which one out of these two pieces of paper have got larger surface area? That one, right? So can you see that? It's just the size basically of the sheet I have. Obviously this is surface area of A4, this is surface area of, what is it, A5, isn't it? So obviously if you have table, there will be area maybe of, I don't know, just over a meter maybe. If you have area of a room, it will be maybe 20 square meters. If it's, you know, tennis court at 70 square meters. Let's now talk about diffusion pathway. That's the distance through which the gases have to go across, right? Now, this is not about looking at my area like this, it's about looking at my area like that, okay? So out of these ones, which ones got shorter diffusion pathway? This sheet of paper or the pad? Shorter diffusion pathway. So if I have gases at the top, right, the alveolus at the top, capillary at the bottom of my pages, which ones got shorter diffusion pathway? So less distance to travel to get from the top of a page to the bottom of a page. Because I have to get through the wall, right? These are the walls. A bit like the wall in that sheet of paper. And
Sheet
this-
of paper.
Right, so sheet of paper's got shorter or longer diffusion, shorter diffusion pathway, right? Shorter area for me to get through. So that wall is thin, whereas in that pad, the wall is relatively thicker. Can you see the difference, right? Can you see the difference between looking at it like this, that's your area, and looking at it like that, which is your diffusion pathway? So don't get confused between the two, because I know there's usually a bit of confusion. All right, so let me return that. Thank you. Okay, so the next point is that I'll have to wipe this off if you don't mind, because I'm running out of space there. So another factor which is helping me is on the inside of alveolus I actually have a very thin layer of water. So I'm going to use a blue pen to show that. So here, lining my alveolus on the inside, so I'm going to use blue just because I associate moisture of water with blue. So this is going to be a thin layer of water or moisture. And this thin layer of moisture is going to help me with diffusion. So thin layer of moisture. Lining alveoli. Now, why does it help with diffusion? Well, when gases arrive in your alveolus, they're obviously in the form of molecules suspended in this air, right? And you somehow have to get them to start diffusing across all of those areas which are all moist, you know, so all of these cells are filled with water mostly, that area here is filled with water. So to facilitate this process, to make it happen, that layer of moisture acts almost like a glue for these molecules of oxygen to land on, to start diffusing down into the cells and further down into capillary. So this is how this thin layer of moisture is also going to initiate diffusion and help for this process to occur more efficiently. And then the last thing which I wanted to mention is that this moisture also contains very particular substance called surfactant. So I'll add it as a part of this label. So thin layer of moisture which contains surfactant. So there's going to be some special cells actually in your alveoli, in this epithelial layer, which are designed to produce this very specific substance called surfactant. What does that do? Well, let me give you a little visual here. You remember that alveoli is incredibly thin. Right, so we're talking about a single layer of cells here, right? Single layer of cells. And those cells are also wet, right? They're moist because of this thin layer of moisture. So imagine something like cling film, and then you put a layer of moisture as well on this cling film. How easy would it be for the walls of this cling film, for the sides of the cling film to just stick together? Can you picture that? They would really want to get stuck, you know, with one side of this bubble get stuck to the other side. And we don't want that to happen, because if those opposite walls get stuck, then it's much harder to then inflate the alveoli again. So we don't want them to be stuck to one another. One side of the alveolus to be stuck on the other side. So that's what surfactant is preventing. So it's stopping the walls of alveoli from sticking to each other. And therefore, you know, keeping alveoli nice and inflated and still maintain that bubble shape. So it stops walls of alveoli from sticking.
What actually is it?
It's just a type of substance which makes it less likely to stick, right? So it's a type of molecules essentially, okay, which are going to be a part of that layer of moisture. And it's got this property of being a bit like Teflon, something which just stops stuff from sticking, okay? Now, can those alveoli potentially get stuck? Yes, they can. In what circumstances? For example, if you have an infection, right? Because maybe that bacteria or that virus, they're producing some sort of substances which are stopping efficient production of surfactant, and then your alveoli are going to get stuck together, right? So it will be harder for this person to breathe. Or, in another scenario, if you had really strong impact, for example, that's something which can happen when somebody gets into a car accident. So they were driving at 70, 80, 90 miles an hour, and then suddenly had a crash, and their car came to a sudden stop, and therefore their lungs had this massive impact. And so not even surfactant is able to prevent from those walls of alveoli sticking. So those sort of scenarios could lead to something called collapsed lung. Have you heard that? So essentially what collapsed lung is when you have a bunch of alveoli walls just sticking together. And you can, in some cases, reinflate the lung, and in some cases, if it's because of severe infection, for example, it might be the case that part of the lung, or maybe the whole lung, will need to be removed because it's just not performing its function, right? So surfactant is really important. Now, one thing which I missed out, and I just realized I missed it out, is there is another thing which is helping with the short diffusion pathway. I did mention squamous cells. I mentioned the short distance, but one thing which I didn't explicitly say is that we have a single layer of cells, right? And nobody kind of noticed that and stopped me. So you also have single layer of cells in the alveolus and also in the wall of a capillary. If I had multiple layers of cells, can you see that would have created wider pathway. So if you have a bit of space left, and if you can find a way of sort of adding one more feature here to go with short diffusion pathway, it will be a single layer walls of alveolus and capillary.